cult centered around one self-proclaimed prophet is bad enough, but what if there was a cult that encouraged everyone to be their own prophet? In fact, what if they hinted that they could teach you how to be a prophet? It almost sounds like there's no way that this can be a real group. But guess what? It is, and it actually led to the death of a woman and her child. Today we are talking all about the School of Prophets. And let me tell you right now, we are going on a wild ride today. So sit back, relax, and take a deep breath. It's time to let the fresh air in. Hi everyone, welcome back, or welcome if you're new. My name is Erin and I am fascinated by all things cults, true crime, and unique spiritual practices. I post 1 or 2 videos on one of these topics every single week, so if you are into this sort of thing too, please consider subscribing. I would absolutely love to have you here. I also have a Patreon that I'm trying to be more active on and a membership on this channel. I want to start launching some members-only lives and some Patreon-only lives. So if you're curious about some lives or you just want to be a financial supporter of the channel, which would be so appreciated, please consider joining the membership or the Patreon, and you will find links to both in the description box down below. So let's jump right into today's video because there's just, it's just mind-blowing. So today we're talking about the Lafferty family. The Lafferty family was tightly rooted in the traditions of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, aka Mormonism. Though the family itself exhibited some very unique dynamics that contributed to the eventual path of Ron and Dan Lafferty, our 2 central people of today's story. Watson Lafferty, their father, the family patriarch, was a strict authoritarian figure who enforced a rigid form of discipline and raised his children with intense religious fervor. His children, including Ron and Dan, grew up with an uncompromising view of obedience to their father and to God, and this made them especially susceptible to extreme interpretations of religious teachings. Their father, Watson, was not just a strict father, he believed deeply in what he considered true LDS teachings, which at that time were increasingly diverging from mainstream Mormonism. See, the mainstream LDS Church had formally abandoned polygamy in 1890, and this led to the gradual mainstreaming of LDS practices and beliefs. However, Watson often expressed disapproval of these changes, instilling in his children a skepticism toward what he saw as the modern version of Mormonism. Homeboy just wanted to be poly, apparently. And it was this skepticism that laid the groundwork for Ron and Dan's later deviation from the LDS Church and their eventual drift toward fundamentalist beliefs. Watson Lafferty was as devout as you could get as it comes to Mormons. He was part of the generation that witnessed the mainstream LDS Church move further and further away from some of its original practices, particularly polygamy. And it was under pressure from the U.S. government that encouraged the church to totally renounce polygamy. And this led to changes in doctrine that started to promote a more socially acceptable type of Mormonism. Although Mormonism to this day is considered among cult experts to be the #1 cult, the largest cult in the entire world. So this change, this push to make Mormonism more socially acceptable, was a defining moment in LDS history, and it signaled the church's efforts to try to integrate more into American society and distance itself from practices that were considered controversial or even illegal. Yeah, I think that if it's illegal, it probably shouldn't be part of your religion. However, Watson, like many within the LDS community, felt a sense of loss and frustration over these changes. For Watson, the abandonment of polygamy was more than just a practical adjustment. It represented a dilution of what he saw as God's true commands. He believed that these were sacred truths that should not be compromised regardless of external pressures. Watson saw the decision to abandon polygamy as a weakening of the church's resolve, and he felt that modern Mormonism had drifted away from the purity of Smith's teachings. This belief created a very unique household environment. Watson's strong opinions shaped the family's religious practices, and he raised his children with a distinct mistrust of mainstream LDS authority. He regularly voiced these criticisms, challenging what he called false Mormonism, and urging his children to look beyond the softened doctrines of the modern church. By constantly sharing his views on religious purity and commitment to early Mormon practices, Watson fostered in his children this feeling of alienation from the mainstream Mormon church. Which is so interesting. It's like, if you disagree with something, why not stop practicing it? Because there were fundamentalist sects that kind of branched off from the Mormon church, but it sounds like this guy honestly just liked to complain. But it was this influence that had a profound impact on the sons, Ron and Dan. While the other members of the community accepted the church's modernizations, the Lafferty brothers grew up questioning the legitimacy of the church's leadership and its authority to be able to redefine what they believed were divine laws. Watson's rigid stance laid the groundwork for the brothers' susceptibility to more extreme beliefs. And as they grew older, Ron and Dan began to feel called to seek out a more pure form of Mormonism. They came to view their father's teachings as closer to the truth than the mainstream churches, seeing him as a figure who had preserved the authentic faith. Yes, that's true. It was their father that was the most authentic Mormon because he wanted to marry a bunch of women and perhaps children. But I digress. So as these boys grew into adults, this skepticism made it easier for them to justify turning away from the mainstream LDS church and embracing the radical ideology of the School of Prophets, a group that aligned with their father's sentiments and pushed them further down the path toward fundamentalism. Watson's distrust of church modernizations ultimately planted the seeds of Ron and Dan's fanaticism and their desire to purify the faith. And this set them on a very dangerous course that would eventually lead to tragedy. So as these boys grew older, Ron and Dan, the eldest of the Lafferty brothers, began to express very open disillusionment with the LDS church. Their frustration centered around what they viewed as the church's abandonment of core doctrines, particularly polygamy. Ron especially felt that the LDS had strayed too far from its origins and sought a purer, more authentic form of Mormonism. And Dan, who looked up to Ron as a spiritual leader, followed his brother down this path, becoming radicalized in his own beliefs. This religious shift in Ron and Dan happened during a period of personal and familial turmoil. So Ron had once had a stable job and a family, suddenly experienced a crisis of faith after his wife, Diana, left him, largely due to his extreme beliefs and pressure for her to accept polygamy. So, good for her, honestly. But this loss further destabilized Ron, and he began claiming to receive direct revelations from God, urging him to pursue a mission of cleansing and purifying his faith. Ron was naturally charismatic, and he possessed a sense of religious destiny that only intensified as he grew older. And since he believed that mainstream Mormonism has lost its way, and he saw himself being called to recover and restore the true faith. So this meant stripping away the compromises the LDS church had made and returning to his idealized pure form of Mormonism. So the loss of his marriage, but also this enhanced sense of self, really triggered a profound personal crisis for Ron. He saw this loss as some kind of divine punishment or a test of faith. So it was during this time that he started claiming to receive those revelations from God. He was seeing visions and believed that he was being guided towards a greater purpose. And he decided he was going to purge anything that stood in the way of what he saw as true Mormonism. And as for Dan, his brother, he was captivated by Ron's leadership and was drawn even deeper into his brother's radical vision. He began to adopt Ron's belief in personal revelation and came to view these supposed divine messages as sacred truths. Together, they grew increasingly isolated from mainstream society and family members who didn't share their views. So their rejection of LDS Church's authority became absolute, and they turned instead to fundamentalist doctrines and self-appointed missions. This path ultimately led them to the school of prophets and the extreme acts that would follow. In their minds, they were already prophets of a purer faith. So in 1982, at the height of their disillusionment, Ron and Dan would encounter Robert C. Crossfield, a self-proclaimed prophet known as Prophet Onius. Crossfield had founded the School of Prophets, a small radical sect that taught a return to the original doctrines of Mormonism. The group was based on Crossfield's book, Second Book of Commandments. What a clever name. This was a collection of supposed revelations from God. Crossfield encouraged this idea that individuals, any individual, could receive personal revelations. And this was a concept that resonated with Ron, who already believed himself to be guided by the divine. So the School of Prophets attracted many disillusioned Mormons who, like Ron and Dan, had felt abandoned by the mainstream church. Crossfield's teaching centered on a fundamentalist view of Mormonism, which included polygamy and personal revelation. And it included a belief that the U.S. government and mainstream LDS churches were corrupt. Ron became convinced that the School of Prophets was the path to reclaiming true Mormonism, and he believed that he was chosen by God for a divine mission. When Ron and Dan met Robert C. Crossfield, they were already in the throes of that spiritual crisis, and they already believed that they were able to talk directly to God. They believed they found this link. So when Prophet Onius, aka Crossfield, presented himself as a prophet and provided an outlet for the Laffertys, they were on board. They were ready to dive right in. And it was Crossfield's book, Second Book of Commandments, which was basically filled with his own revelations, became a sacred text within the group. And honestly, if you're someone that feels disillusioned by a church, if you're somebody that is seeking meaning, and you join a group that tells you that you have a direct link to God, all you have to learn to do is listen to that link, and that means that you are being communicated a revelation that could be the truth for everybody else, you're going to feel special. You're going to feel a little self-important, most likely, and you might even feel like you belong. I mean, if you have a belief that you are connected to God him or herself, wouldn't it sound like a great group to be in? It seems like this was a breeding ground for attracting people that were feeling left out of their church. So Crossfield claimed that his book did contain direct revelations from God, and thus it was an extension of Mormon scripture that was meant to guide the faithful back to the original tenets of the religion. So it was filled with teachings that diverged significantly from those of the mainstream church, including commands to practice polygamy and a return to communal living, and a rejection of secular institutions. This second book also encouraged members to challenge governmental authority, viewing it as a corrupt force working against God's will. One of the most significant teachings that attracted the Laffertys was Crossfield's emphasis on personal revelation. Unlike the LDS Church, which discouraged personal revelations that contradicted church doctrine, Crossfield encouraged his followers to believe that each of them could receive direct communication from God. And this idea of receiving individualized divine instructions appealed especially to Ron, who was already believing that he was experiencing prophetic visions. Crossfield's endorsement of personal revelations gave Ron a powerful sense of validation and suggested that his experiences were not only legitimate, but an indication of his elevated spiritual status. The School of Prophets also fostered a sense of elitism among its members. Crossfield encouraged his followers to see themselves as a chosen group, entrusted with restoring true faith. He taught them that only a select few could truly understand God's will and that mainstream Mormonism had fallen under the influence of corrupt leadership. This exclusivity gave members a sense of purpose and identity, allowing them to feel justified in rejecting the mainstream LDS church and society. They saw themselves as God's army, and this sense of divine mission made them willing to reject family, community, and conventional morality if these things stood in the way of what they believed was their higher calling. The teachings of the School of Prophets became the ideological framework that shaped Ron and Dan's increasingly extreme views. By participating in this community, they found not only validation, but also the means to justify their violent intentions. Crossfield's teachings about the corrupt nature of secular and religious institutions, combined with his encouragement of personal revelation, created an environment that fostered radicalization. In this space, Ron became convinced that his divine missions to cleanse and purify the faith were legitimate commands from God. And Dan, who was deeply devoted to Ron, embraced all of these beliefs as well. And under the influence of the School of Prophets, Ron's revelations started to take on a darker tone. He began to claim that God had commanded him to remove certain people that he saw as obstacles to the faith, including his very own sister-in-law, Brenda Lafferty, who had opposed his fundamentalist beliefs and reportedly encouraged his own wife to leave him. This perceived opposition became, in Ron's mind, a direct threat to his divinely appointed mission. But the School of Prophets had given him a framework that justified these extreme thoughts, and he saw his intentions as part of a righteous duty to fulfill God's will. The School of Prophets justified and provided Ron and Dan with both the theological and emotional reinforcements they needed in order to take their beliefs to a violent extreme. By immersing themselves in this radical community, they felt free from the constraints of mainstream religion, society, and morality, and they felt empowered to act in ways that would have been previously completely unthinkable. The group's teachings had cultivated this worldview that allowed Ron and Dan to see themselves execute this plan, even if that plan involved violent actions that could and would ultimately lead to tragic consequences. And this ideology, combined with their fervent belief in personal revelation, set the stage for these horrible events. So, who is this Robert Crossfield character, and how did the School of Prophets even come to be? So the School of Prophets was founded in the early 1980s by Robert C. Crossfield, who was a Canadian-born former member of the LDS Church. He believed that he was a prophet receiving new divine revelations. And his journey to forming the school began with that classic disillusionment with mainstream Mormonism, particularly because polygamy was basically outlawed. And he wanted to connect more with the ideology of the religion's founder, Joseph Smith. Now, in the LDS's early days, the concept of a school of prophets existed as a group that Joseph Smith formed in 1833 to instruct very select followers in the doctrine and work through their own spiritual gifts and even priesthood responsibilities. So Crossfield drew inspiration from Joseph Smith's vision, and he believed that he could basically recreate it and revive what he saw as the true, uncorrupted tenets of the faith. So Crossfield would eventually claim that he had begun to receive these new revelations from God, and he decided that he was going to document them and compile them into what he called the Second Book of Commandments. Now, this book was considered by him to be a continuation of Mormon scripture, and it instructed followers to reestablish those early Mormon doctrines, especially the practice of polygamy. So Crossfield taught that this book was divinely inspired and filled with commandments that superseded the mainstream LDS Church's teachings. So this book was a guide for those willing to live according to God's unaltered intentions, which included plural marriage, communal living, and resistant to governmental and even church authority. It's almost like this is the failing version of what the FLDS ended up becoming, if that makes sense. So Crossfield officially founded the School of Prophets as this small group of followers who are all united by their shared belief in his revelations. So he did prop himself up as the leader of this school where he would be able to teach others how to connect to God. He named it after the early LDS School of Prophets to underscore the continuity with Mormonism origins and framed his group as a return to the true original faith. So it was established as this radical alternative to the mainstream LDS Church, serving as a sanctuary, for lack of a better term, for those who felt betrayed by the modern church's rejection of those early doctrines. So this School of Prophets attracted a variety of followers, but mostly people who were either disillusioned or even excommunicated from the mainstream Mormon religion or church. They were seeking this pure form of Mormonism. Think FLDS, with all of the disturbing multiple brides and even child brides and arranged marriages and communal living. So Crossfield's teaching emphasized three main concepts. For one, we have personal revelation. This is that God is communicating directly to just his chosen followers, and this allowed only certain individuals to receive personal instructions from God. Whereas in mainstream Mormon religion, there is only one person who has that connection to God, and that is the leader of the church. So suggesting that individuals could receive divine guidance immediately from God was very attractive to some people. He also had this idea of divine authority over secular and church leaders. So Crossfield's teachings included a very strong anti-establishment message. He preached that the LDS and secular governments were all corrupt institutions that had strayed from God's will. So he encouraged followers to prioritize their own personal revelations over all directives from the mainstream religion or even from government authorities. So basically, if they believed God told them to do something, even if it broke laws, it was unpunishable in their eyes. And of course, we have the return to those communal living situations and polygamy, which was like the central theme. I'm getting so tired of talking about polygamy. These guys, they really just wanted to take multiple wives. I am convinced that that's the only reason that they started this School of Prophets, because then that allows anyone to just say, well, God told me I needed another wife. Oh, great. Really? God told you that? God told you that? Interesting. So although this group was small in numbers, the School of Prophets resonated deeply with the followers. And the followers started feeling like they were special, they were elite, because they all had that direct connection to God, and God's word was more important and should be more followed than any other rule made for or by man. So for these followers, Crossfield's teachings gave them that sense of purpose and validation, and it empowered them to reject church and secular law. This framework of extreme beliefs and personal revelation would ultimately create a setting where individuals felt justified in taking extreme actions, including violence, if they believed it was divinely mandated. So Crossfield's School of Prophets didn't directly order acts of violence, but its teachings about personal revelation and divine authority over earthly institutions laid a very dangerous ideological foundation. For those seeking absolute answers like the Laffertys, the school's radical beliefs provided that framework. So it meant that they could basically do whatever they wanted to anyone if they believed God was telling them to do it. It's truly a tragic chapter in the history of religious extremism. So in early 1984, just 2 years after joining the School of Prophets, Ron Lafferty started claiming that his revelations were taking on this disturbing intensity. He announced to his family and group of followers or supporters that he had received a divine command instructing him to, quote, remove, unquote, specific individuals whom he deemed to be blocking God's plan. And at the top of this list was his sister-in-law, Brenda Lafferty, and her young daughter, Erica, who I'm pretty sure is an infant. So Brenda Lafferty was his other brother's wife. So not Dan's wife, not Ron's wife, but the third youngest brother's wife. And Brenda was the one who encouraged Ron's ex-wife to leave Ron when Ron started telling her that he wanted to practice polygamy. So according to Ron, and this is also coming from God because of the personal revelations, so according to God, aka Ron and his fragile male ego, Brenda was a threat to his entire mission and to the values that he was trying to uphold within the family. So let's learn a little bit more about Brenda. Brenda Lafferty was born Brenda Wright, and she came from a loving and supportive family in Twin Falls, Idaho. She was raised in a devout LDS household where faith, education, and community service were central values. Brenda was the youngest of 6 children and grew up in an environment that encouraged independence, intellectual curiosity, and a sense of responsibility. Her family was close-knit, and she maintained a strong bond with her parents and siblings throughout her life. Unlike the strict authoritarian upbringing that the Lafferty brothers experienced, Brenda's home life was nurturing and grounded in principles that emphasized kindness, resilience, and faith. She was also a bright and ambitious young woman. She excelled academically in high school and was known for her cheerful personality and her very strong convictions. Her upbringing in a supportive, education-focused family inspired her to pursue higher education and follow her interests in journalism and communication. She attended Brigham Young University, or BYU, which is a massive Mormon college located in Provo, Utah, and this is where she studied broadcast journalism. You see, she had these dreams of becoming a television anchor or a journalist, and she was so passionate about using her voice to make a positive impact. At BYU, Brenda's vivacious personality and charm made her well-liked among her peers. She was known for her intelligence, her independence, and strong moral values, all of which she carried with her throughout her entire life. She was ambitious and outspoken, and these were traits that really distinguished her within her community, as she often spoke up on issues that she felt were important. And when you're in a very patriarchal structure, specifically in Mormonism, where there has never really been any woman in a leadership position, whether at the head of the church or as an elder or otherwise, this could be seen as kind of threatening to the men there, but also super badass. She was not one to shy away from standing her ground or challenging ideas that she didn't agree with, even if those ideas came from family or religious authority. So Brenda met Alan Lafferty, the youngest of the Lafferty brothers, while she was at BYU, and the two were quickly drawn to each other because they shared that strong faith in the LDS Church. Brenda was deeply in love with Alan and very hopeful about building a future together. The couple ended up getting married and started their lives together with Brenda's family's full support. They admired Alan's kindness and his strong beliefs. However, Brenda's entry into the Lafferty family brought her into a radically different environment from the one she'd grown up in. The Lafferty family, particularly Ron and Dan, held those extreme views on Mormonism that Brenda obviously found troubling. As Ron and Dan began to embrace those fundamentalist ideas, Brenda openly opposed them and refused to be influenced by what she saw as a harmful and misguided interpretation of their faith. Brenda's independence and strong moral compass made her a vocal opponent of the extremist views that Ron and Dan had adopted and even promoted. She believed in the LDS faith and supported the mainstream church, And she rejected the radical doctrines and practices that Ron and Dan were trying to promote within their very own family. Brenda actually encouraged her husband, Alan, to distance himself from his brother's influence, and she did her best to try to protect her family from the growing tension between mainstream Mormonism and the extreme ideology that Ron and Dan were adopting. And Brenda's influence extended beyond her own household. She, like I said, was the one who encouraged Ron's wife, Diana, to stand up to her husband's demands, particularly his insistence on practicing polygamy. And this support from Brenda gave Diana the courage to leave Ron. And this was obviously a decision that Ron saw unforgivable. He saw it as an act of defiance. So to Ron, Brenda had become this symbol of resistance against his supposed divine mission. And he came to see her as a direct obstacle to all of his goals. Brenda's courage in standing up to Ron and Dan's ideology ultimately put her in great danger, as her opposition was seen as a threat to their vision of what true Mormonism was. Brenda Lafferty is remembered as a bright, caring, and courageous woman who stood up for her beliefs even in the face of extreme opposition. And we're about to talk more about it, but her tragic death, along with that of her daughter, absolutely shocked the community. And it highlighted the devastating consequences of unchecked religious extremism. So what exactly happened to Brenda and her 15-month-old daughter? Well, Ron's ideology had grown so extreme that he was able to rationalize the need to eliminate any potential threat, regardless of age or innocence. So when people ask, why would he also murder her daughter? Well, this was kind of a belief that was kind of consistent with the Old Testament. And it was this Old Testament ideology that inspired the fanaticism that he had adopted, which he felt justified his harsh measures. See, he thought that Erica, the infant, would inherit the traits that Brenda had, meaning that since Brenda was so opposed to his teachings, then Erica would have inherited that opposition. So he was able to justify the murder of both of them. Really, he is using this fanatical and honestly crazy belief from a woman who is just trying to support another woman who doesn't want her husband to cheat on her by engaging in polygamy, encourages that wife to leave her husband. So now she's become the scapegoat because he was rejected and he thought that that was just so blasphemous. He was able to target her. And since the school of prophets promotes this idea of personal revelation, that Ron was able to claim that he received personal revelation to cleanse the planet of anyone who opposed his religion. So he saw this as a sacred obligation to carry out God's will. In his view, refusing to act on this so-called revelation would mean that he was defying God, an option that he just would not accept. And Dan, who was fully loyal to Ron and shared these radical views, became convinced that Ron's revelation was genuine and real. Together, they plotted the violent, quote, removal, unquote, of Brenda and Erica, framing it as an act of divine justice. The school of prophets and their belief in personal revelation fueled their conviction and reinforced the idea that they were chosen instruments to carry out a higher purpose. So they really believed that God had granted them the authority to decide who was worth living and who would die. It was truly a disturbing interpretation of the faith. So on the fateful day, on July 24th, 1984, Ron and Dan Lafferty arrived at Brenda's apartment in American Fork, Utah, with the intent to carry out what Ron believed to be a divine command. The date held particular significance for the Lafferty brothers. It was Pioneer Day, a Utah state holiday that commemorates the arrival of the first Mormon pioneers in the Salt Lake Valley. To Ron, this day seemed fitting for his so-called mission because he saw it as a symbolic act of reclaiming the original faith from those he viewed as obstacles. So that day, Brenda was home alone with her 15-month-old daughter when the brothers arrived. Alan, her husband, Ron's younger brother, was away at work. They forced their way into her home, and Brenda fought desperately, but she was ultimately overpowered by the two men. The attack was brutal, and they showed no mercy. After murdering Brenda, they turned their attention to her daughter Erica. And in their twisted interpretation of the faith, Erica represented that continuation of Brenda's influence, and so she was deemed a future threat to their religious mission. Convinced their actions were commanded by God, they showed no remorse as they took Erica's life as well. Immediately after the murders, Ron and Dan went into hiding. Their belief in their divine mission was fueled by this sense of invincibility, and yet they fled. They were hiding, but they believed that they would be protected by God from capture. They saw themselves as martyrs on a sacred journey, and their confidence was only bolstered by their commitment to their extreme beliefs. To avoid law enforcement, they carefully planned their escape. They moved from one state to another and stayed at cheap motels to try to remain inconspicuous. They crossed into multiple different states and avoided major cities and stuck to small towns. They tried to blend in and not really have many interactions with others because they wanted to reduce the risk of being recognized. Because this had become a nationwide manhunt at this point, and it had gained extensive media coverage. Law enforcement agencies across multiple states, including the FBI, coordinated their efforts to locate the brothers. And the fact that this innocent woman and her daughter had been murdered just shocked the public and intensified the search. Investigators were fearful that Ron and Dan might attempt more violence because they were so fanatical, so they were determined to capture the brothers before any more harm could be done. But Ron and Dan seemed unfazed by the pursuit. They felt they were guided by divine intervention, and they took their ability to evade capture as a sign of God's protection. Yeah. Ron actually viewed this manhunt as part of his religious test, and he believed that if they were caught or killed, it would only further validate their cause. It's just like cognitive dissonance over and over and over again. It's just shocking that someone can believe this so deeply. And Dan just kind of followed Ron's lead and believed they were part of this mission that transcended any earthly consequence. But the chase came to an end just about 5 weeks later on August 7th, 1984, when law enforcement tracked the brothers down in Reno, Nevada. They actually acted on a tip, and police officers were able to surround the location where Ron and Dan were hiding and apprehend them without any real resistance. It was truly a moment of relief for the public, especially in Utah, where these crimes had really shaken the community. And of course, the case was national news, with the shocking details of the murder and the fanatical beliefs leading to widespread media coverage and public outrage. And it's just so ironic that they really believed that they were doing the best work for God that they could, when publicly, when people found out about their actions and their beliefs, they were repulsed by it. And not just public outrage, but the public was just confused and scared and wanted to stay as far away from any type of fanatical religious belief like theirs. So their push for this real, true Mormon belief only made them push more people away because they were able to justify murder. And who wants to be a part of any religious organization that can justify an act like that? An innocent mother and her baby. So the investigation was intense, and following their capture, it exposed the disturbing influence of the school of prophets on the brothers' actions. The trial that ensued revealed the depths of Ron and Dan's radicalism, and it provided a look into how these extreme beliefs had escalated into violence. But in court, Ron showed absolutely no remorse and just kept insisting that he'd been carrying out God's will, a stance that honestly appalled the jury and onlookers. Dan's loyalty, too, was just unbroken, and he also appeared unrepentant, reiterating his belief in the righteousness of their actions. The trial became one of the most shocking displays of religious extremism and fanaticism in recent history. It was held in Utah in the mid-1980s, and it captivated the public because they learned of the brutal murders and the beliefs that drove the brothers to commit these acts. Ron, in particular, took the stand and was chillingly calm. He spoke with conviction about his role as a prophet, and he claimed he had this revelation and he had to remove Brenda and her child because they were obstacles to God's will. And I feel like it's probably how people watched Lori Vallow's trial and they were just like, you are really, really indoctrinated, girl. Like, you really don't recognize the pain you caused. You murdered your own children. It's just shocking. And what makes it even more disturbing is hearing the words come out of their mouths, you know? And what's weird is at the heart of Ron's defense was that he claimed that he'd received a divine command. And of course, onlookers were like, that is your excuse? You're just going to keep saying that God instructed you to eliminate those you see as opposing your religious mission? I mean, he had utter and total confidence and positioned himself as an obedient servant of God who had no choice but to follow the divine orders to murder 2 people. He showed absolutely no remorse, and combined with his insistence that he was a prophet, it was altogether very unsettling for the jury. But he remained unflinchingly righteous. He presented his actions as totally justified and insisted that he was being guided by divine authority. And the court, the jury, it was really difficult for anyone to reconcile the calm demeanor in which he spoke about the violence of his actions. It was disturbing and confusing for people. And Dan, although less vocal than Ron, mirrored those beliefs and exhibited the same lack of remorse. He openly admitted in court that he believed he was doing God's work by assisting in the murders, and asserted that he had followed Ron's instructions because he shared the conviction that it was all God's will. It's utterly shocking and sad. And this stance just underscored the dangerous power of charismatic radical leadership within the context of some extreme religious belief. And I can't help but think that, like, there are certain aspects, certain religions that still operate similarly today, where just every action is justified somehow by God's will or God's word, when it's like inherently evil or diminishing or harmful to other human beings that are just trying to like live their lives. Now, interestingly, even back in the 80s, a significant part of the trial was devoted to examining the teachings of the School of Prophets and understand how its influence had fueled the Lafferty brothers' fanaticism and their violent actions. It's so interesting because even nowadays, in 2024, it can be difficult to try to get people to understand how cults are able to create these beliefs and indoctrinate their followers so that they can commit atrocious acts. But witnesses testified even back in the 80s about the school's teachings, and particularly the emphasis it had on personal revelation and its encouragement of followers to prioritize those divine commands over any legal or moral obligation. So the testimonies highlighted how Robert Crossfield's second book of commandments had promoted the idea that each follower could receive those direct revelations from God, which often placed them, that human being, above all secular and religious authority. So this approach, coupled with Crossfield's denouncement of the mainstream LDS church and saying that they're all corrupt, it just fostered this dangerous mindset among the school's members, and this allowed them to justify their hateful and violent actions and thoughts. The courtroom heard stories of Crossfield's teachings and this really intense shift that it caused in members like the Laffertys, who took that idea of personal revelation to just such an extreme level. Witnesses also explained that the school's focus on separatism and disdain for secular authorities had helped reinforce the Laffertys' beliefs that their mission was justified by any action, even murder, because God told them to do it. So this exploration of the School of Prophets served as this stark reminder of how religious ideology can be manipulated to create this sense of divine license that totally disregards human consequences. And the public reaction of the trial was one of just sheer horror and disbelief. The details revealed in court painted this picture that many found incomprehensible. People still to this day struggle to understand how individuals could be just so convinced of their own self-righteousness that they would commit murder, or in certain cases in modern day society, branding themselves or recommitting to living off the grid with a man who has essayed many women, or countless other examples. It is still so confusing for us because I think majority of us would never be able to justify these actions just because of a religious organization. I'd like to think that a lot of people's critical thinking would chime in, but the fact that this has happened for so many decades, for so long, only proves that we need to talk about these things more, because this is a reminder that this radical ideology and the power of indoctrination, particularly when it's reinforced by some kind of charismatic leader, claims divine authority, people are able to justify the most atrocious actions. And so Ron's lack of repentance and his open declaration of himself as a prophet totally unnerved the public. People saw him as a dangerous example of religious zeal and the potential for violence when one's moral code is replaced by an absolute belief in some personal revelation. And Dan's willingness to just follow along his brother despite the severity of the actions required also showed people that this is really concerning. It's frightening that there can be such an influence on one's individual core beliefs and able to spread that belief to others. So Ron was sentenced to death, and Dan received a life sentence. Despite both those convictions, though, neither brother expressed remorse or ever reconsidered their actions. In the years following his sentencing, Ron appealed his conviction many times, bringing up questions about his mental health, given his continued insistence of his prophetic mission. However, his unwavering belief in his divine mission remained a constant, and he maintained that he was acting as God's servant when he murdered both the woman and her daughter, all the way up until his death in 2019. This whole situation is a painful reminder of how belief, when taken to an extreme, can lead to tragedy and horror. This case has been studied as a grim lesson on the intersections of faith, mental health, and the perilous power of absolute conviction. And although Crossfield's school of prophets did not explicitly order the Laffertys to commit murder, its teachings created a dangerous ideological environment where violent actions could be rationalized as obedience to some divine command. By encouraging followers to act on what they thought were personal revelations and reject any external authority, the school effectively removed any checks or balances on the brothers' actions. The belief that personal revelations had a divine authority allowed Ron to interpret his own violent impulses that were not directives from above as instead holy mandates, while the anti-establishment philosophy that was held within the school totally dismissed the need to conform to any laws or other moral boundaries that are set by humanity or society. The school of prophets ultimately exposed the potential dangers of unchecked religious power and the power of indoctrination or radical ideology. No religious movement should justify murdering another human being simply because they critically think about the beliefs that you're promoting. That is extreme. That is horrifying. And I hope that it serves as an important lesson for anyone who's watched so far. So I know that was a lot, and I'm really grateful that you were here. So thank you so much for exploring this absolutely harrowing story. It is absolutely so heartbreaking. And I know I kept you here for a long time. So if you made it all the way here, please leave a black heart in the comment section down below so I know y'all are sticking with me. And please remember to check out the Patreon and membership down below. What do you guys think about this case? It makes me so nervous because I know that although there is separation of church and state and there is a freedom of religion in America anyways, it is really concerning how much power religion has, how much power any type of belief system can actually justify someone's actions, how it makes people feel like they're above the law or they are above any man-made rule or expectation or morality. And it's scary how someone's pure hatred for someone and desire to ruin them or hurt them in some way can be justified by their religion or their cultic belief. And it's kind of concerning that I feel like we see that a lot here, where for some reason, especially with the kind of political landscape that we're in, oftentimes we find some racist or sexist or otherwise demeaning or harmful rhetoric being spouted under this veil of it being, a Christian belief, when it's like, where do you see that in the Bible? I thought we were all supposed to love each other. And I've said before, I don't really align myself with any one belief. That was part of the drive for my channel, was just being curious about different beliefs and how we get there and why certain religions are so massive and kind of people consider America like a Christian nation. But we also are not supposed to be combining the law with any religion at all. In fact, the law is supposed to keep these religions and cults. It's supposed to serve as some kind of checks and balances. So when we don't have that, because we want to believe that there's only one religion, well, there simply isn't. And wouldn't we all be better off if we just let everybody believe what they wanted to believe, as long as they weren't harming themselves or others? Because the alternative feels like people's hatred or disdain for another person, for whatever reason, is somehow justified through their faith. And I think that the Mormon religion is considered to be part of a Christian faith. So I don't know. I'm probably just rambling here. That's just kind of how I feel about the situation, or feel about this case. And it hits close to home just because I see that a lot of ill treatment of others can be justified by some kind of religious belief, whether it's Christianity or another belief that has really, stern, stark rules that ostracize or otherwise control another member of that society, whether it's controlling women or controlling homosexual people or controlling people of different races. You see it pop up all over the world, and it seems to always be justified by some kind of religious practice. And so that's not to say there's any one religion that's better than the other. I think we just need to recognize what is our own negative feeling or thought towards somebody, and what is actually a true and honest belief. What's the difference between morality and ethics, especially when it comes to our religion? And do you want to partake in a religion that's able to justify ill treatment of another person or hatred towards another person? Because for me, I want to accept everyone as they are. I want to accept people and learn from them and explore what their cultures are like, explore how they behave, and hear their opinions, even if they are different than my own. It's just so interesting that religion and these cults are such a driving force behind people's behavior, that they're able to justify really, really, really bad behavior based off of whatever their religion is. But I'm done ranting and raving and rambling, so I want to hear what y'all have to say. Please keep it polite in the comments. I don't want this to be a space where anyone feels bullied, but I'm always open to feedback and open to your, discourse, as long as it's respectful. So please just keep it respectful in the comments and polite. And thank you guys all so much. I really appreciate you joining me here today. Please stay safe out there. Always ask questions and always stay skeptical. And if any person in any position of power gets angry that you ask them questions, then that should be a red flag for you. It doesn't matter if it's your principal, your boss, your religious leader, governmental leader, whomever it is, you should be able to be critical and ask questions, because in the end, they're there to serve you. They're there to help you in some way. So anyways, I've been talking a long time. My lights are going out. So thank you guys so much, and I will see you in my next video soon. You have a great one, and just be safe.